Going out camping can be very refreshing. As a matter of fact, I've never had a bad experience. Unfortunately, that's not the case for everybody. Even though it can be a very enjoyable experience, you really need to be careful because of the inherent dangers of nature, predators, inclement weather. They can pose a challenge, but even taking the best precautions, that doesn't always ensure your safety, as we're about to find out. It's said that Alaskan girls are built tough. They change tires, hunt, fish, camp, and generally have a great appreciation for the outdoors. The joke is that Anchorage is the biggest rural city in the country. All this brings the context to the following story. In high school, things were different, or at least felt different. I was a young and stupid woman. I thought I could conquer anything, due to the aforementioned built tough attitude that I was raised with. Senior year high school, I decided to treat myself with a camping trip. Go up to the mountains. They were beautiful that time of year. Going up north in peak summer has a weird feeling to it. The sun never really sets. It kind of gives you a false sense of security, thinking that the midnight sun means safety, but really it's not. It almost got me killed, or worse. I made the big mistake of not telling anyone where I was going. I packed up for the trip and left. I stopped at Subway for lunch, then headed out for the great beyond. The drive was fine. It was a solid 2.5 hours. Tall spruce and evergreen trees lined the road. And since occasionally you see empty spaces due to clear-cut logging, it kind of gives you the sense that even though you're in the wilderness, you still feel connected to civilization. That's really a mistake though. Which was another mistake I made. I wasn't staying at a state park or a campground. I decided to rough it in the woods, in the middle of nowhere. I was in high school with only a part-time job. It didn't pay very well, so I didn't want to have to pay for the $15 overnight camp fee. I was too scared to risk a fine, so I went to the middle of nowhere. I got a map from my dad that showed an old mining site. It was nearby a mountain. And I decided I want to spend the night at a mining ghost town. I pulled off the road, packed up my backpack, and put on some bug spray, grabbed the map and compass, and started off into the woods. Now, this wasn't the first time I've done this. I've been in the wilderness before backpacking. I've done this throughout my childhood. I knew my orientation skills, I've taken some wilderness survival courses, and I wasn't dumb, because I wouldn't wander off into the woods with no idea where I was, or so I thought. I had a solid 45-minute hike, and I finally made it where the old mining camp used to be, or supposed to be. There was nothing there, just old concrete foundations and some holes, nothing else. I was very disappointed, but unsurprised at the outcome. I set up camp off in the woods and built a fire on a concrete slab. You're supposed to set up cooking away from your camp, just in case bears get nosy. The last thing you want is a 1,300-pound grizzly poking their nose into your tent, wondering why it smells like Campbell's soup and s'mores. By this time it was getting late. The sun was still high in the sky, and it was as dark as it was going to get, so I went into my tent for the night. I was confident enough that the overgrowth gave me privacy. Later that night, I awoke to some voices in the distance. There was some slow-moving crashing through the underbrush. My first thought was hunters. This wasn't uncommon, because me and my dad, we used to run into a few campouts, so it wasn't uncommon. I relaxed and figured they would just pass through without incident, and I closed my eyes again. That's when they found my fire pit. A man's voice cried out in the forest. "Who the f*** camping on our property?" I froze. I knew I screwed up. I got up and I grabbed my purse and I put my shoes on so I can go apologize before I heard the man again say, "When we find you, you're dead. This is private militia property, and trespassers get shot." That's when the whole situation changed. I didn't know what to do. I couldn't just pack up the tent and leave, especially with some armed guys lurking around outside. I carefully put on my shoes, put my keys in my purse, and slunk away into the underbrush. I did this as quietly as I could. My thought was to slip away, wait until they got bored and left, then go back, pack up, and leave. I spent 20 minutes hidden behind a log in the woods. Barely in earshot, I heard a second voice calling out to the others. They found my tent, and they were tearing it apart, going through all of my stuff. I heard one of them shout out, "The bed's still warm. The trespasser's a chick. She left her underwear. Okay, Fan out, let's find her. If this thinks she can trespass, she's got hell to pay. At this point, I wasn't concerned about my spare change of underwear or my bag. I just needed to get out of there. As quietly as possible, I made my way down the mountain for about 30 minutes, tiptoeing and taking care not to step on twigs. After the rustling and the shouting of the men faded quite a bit, I booked it as fast as I could. I tripped and fell and got scraped up more times than I can care to remember. Finally, I made it back to the road. But to my horror, there was no car. I knew I had come out down by the road, so I picked a direction and I started walking. I rounded the corner and I saw my car, and 2 of the men were standing beside it. They were armed and they were dressed in surplus military gear. I hid in the bush by the side of the road and watched. A while later, several more men appeared. They appeared from the trail where I just came from. They dumped all my stuff next to my car and hopped back on their ATVs, and they drove off. I went back to my car, careful not to be seen, and I found a note on my dashboard. It read something like, "If we ever catch you on our property again, we won't hesitate to use force. Consider this a warning." I went back to start loading my stuff in the car, and I noticed what they had done. They had cut up and destroyed all of my gear, probably as punishment for trespassing. Honestly, I'm thankful that they did that because I'm just grateful I wasn't shot, or worse. I've taken great care in only camping in designated camping areas. I don't want that to ever happen again. I live in the foothills of the Appalachian Mountains in northeast Georgia. A few years ago, 2 of my friends and I decided to go play paintball in the national forest. It's probably not legal, I know. We decided to turn the paintball expedition into a camping trip so that we could play the next morning too. After a pretty uneventful day of shooting paintballs at each other, we drove a couple of miles to one of the more popular sites to camp. Unfortunately, there was a church group, and they'd taken up all the spots in the area. This was really the only camping spot we were familiar with, and it was getting pretty late, so we decided to keep on looking. We'd drive for about an hour, further and further into the woods. By this time, it's getting a bit dark, and we're getting a bit worried about finding a spot. We all had GPS on our smartphones, but none of us had service. We turned off onto this unfamiliar road. It wasn't in very good shape. In fact, it looked like the Forest Service Rangers used a backhoe to block off the road with this huge amount of dirt. There was a broken metal barrier laying in the woods nearby. That said, it looked like 4x4 vehicles had been going over the mound, so it was pretty worn down. We were in our F-150, and it had pretty high clearance, so we decided to go over the mound. There was an old gravel road on the other side, and the road was pretty much clear of debris. We drove a few miles down the road, and we came across an opening next to a small creek. There was some blue tarps hanging over a plywood table that was nailed to a tree, which seemed kind of odd. That said, it was pretty much dark at that point, and we didn't want to keep driving around, so we left the truck lights on and we set up a tent. As we were setting up the tent, we started to notice there was a lot of trash in the woods in the surrounding area. I see a green bottle lying on the ground. I look at the label, and it looks like a bottle of garden insecticide. I'm really tired at this point. I thought that someone's probably just dumping here from their home garbage. None of us thought it was weird that someone would be dumping some garbage here in this area, even though it was like an hour from the nearest home. We set up camp, had some beers, and made some chili. By this time, it was probably around 11 p.m. We were eating, and we noticed a faint glow from the other side of the nearby hill. At first, we thought it was the moonlight that was filtering through the trees. However, the angle didn't make any sense. It didn't seem to be a bright light, and it wasn't moving. It's kind of like the glow that you see over a bright city. We couldn't see the light source, and since there was no other access to the road, we decided that it probably wasn't other campers. The hill was about a quarter of a mile from the campsite, so in our drunken state, we decided to go investigate. Under normal circumstances, I wouldn't have done this. However, after a few rums and cokes, it kind of lowers your inhibition, and you're more prone to make stupid decisions. We decided to go take a look. My other friend Isaac decided to stay behind and pop some popcorn over the fire. We started walking toward the light source, and the situation got even stranger. All the trees in the area had their bark knocked off in a circle around the trunks. We thought it could have been a beaver, but it seemed kind of strange that all these trees would have their bark knocked off in a circle. Because of our stupid drunkenness, we started talking about a ghost beaver in a pretty loud voice. We almost got to the top of the hill when Jacob tripped and he yelled, "Oh shit!" A few seconds later, the light, whatever it was, went out. We looked at each other and we decided that maybe we didn't need to know what the light was after all, so we walked back in silence. We kept looking back every few seconds. We decided to turn off our flashlight and just navigate by the moonlight back to our campsite. When we got a couple 100 feet from the campsite, we see our other friend Isaac walking around the campsite. He was wearing a hooded coat. He hadn't been wearing it before. For some reason, he was carrying his paintball gun around with him. That seemed a bit odd. The fire had started to die down, so we couldn't see the campsite very well. At this point, we'd probably been gone for almost an hour. From the distance, it looked like Isaac was looking for something. He kept walking around the site and peering into the tent. When we were almost there, Isaac walked up the road and disappeared into the woods. We figured he was going to the bathroom, and he didn't want to wander in our direction. So when we got back, we sat next to the fire and waited for Isaac to come back. All of a sudden, we see him lurch out of the tent. He stumbles a few feet and vomits. After we left, he had a few more rums and cokes. He mumbles. We ask him why he kept wandering around the campsite with a paintball gun. He gets a strange look on his face. They're locked up in the cab of the truck. We go check the truck. It's locked up. And we notice that all the paintball equipment is still in there. I get this sinking feeling in the pit of my stomach. Isaac, what were you doing after we left? I was watching a movie on my phone. Then I fell asleep, I guess. But you were walking around with your paintball gun, right? Did you just change jackets? Isaac said he's been in his tent ever since we left, that he's been wearing the same thing all night. So someone was walking around our campsite, and it wasn't Isaac. At this point, all of us are way too drunk to drive, but we decided to go ahead and pack up our things and go. We didn't bother packing up our tent. We just folded it down with the sleeping bags, with everything in it, and we just threw it in the back. When we got to the dirt hump, we see something gray blocking the path. It's the metal barrier that was lying in the woods earlier. It's back up on its stand, right on top of the hump. By this point, we're all sobering up because of the situation. No one wants to get out of the car to try to move the barrier. I had a metal guard on the front of the F-150, so I decided to drive forward slowly. I tapped the metal barrier with the truck, and it fell right off. It must have been just balanced on top. We drove over it very slowly. We was terrified that it was going to pop the tires, but fortunately, it didn't. As we drove down the road, we see a vehicle following us from behind, and its lights are turned off. It's probably 1,000 feet behind us. We keep catching glimpses of it from the moon's reflection. I start to drive as fast as I can, but somehow this vehicle keeps pace. It doesn't get any closer, but it stays just 1 or 2 turns behind us. We can only see it when the road straightens up. After about 45 minutes of speeding along the gravel roads, we make it back to the main paved road. I start to drive everyone back to my house. We decided to go a different way, just to be safe. Now, luckily, I didn't get pulled over for a DUI, but from then on, we're a lot more careful. Camping can be fun, but very rural camping can be very dangerous. For a little backstory, I was a scout since I was 8 years old. Last year, I was a leader for the team, so I had to do all the paperwork and calls and finding the place to camp. It was around mid-November. I had to find a place to camp. Since I was lazy, I decided to wait until the actual weekend. A week before the weekend, I decided to call some owners so I can find a place where we could sleep. As I call many numbers, all the owners are unavailable or simply not here. But then I see a number that I've never called before. It was at the end of the list. I call it, and an old lady picks up the phone. I do the basic presentation and all, and she agrees to let us stay. So we make the arrangement. That afternoon, we go to her property and we check everything out, like the potable water, the places where to put our tents, and the campfire. The place is kind of dark, but it's quite nice. The week passes, and Saturday arrives. The Saturday is ending well. We did some great games, we ate a lot, we had a good night show. As we go to sleep in our tents, I stay awake to finish my paperwork. It comes up on midnight, so I decide to go to sleep because I had to wake up early to go to church. So I switch off my flashlight, and one of my newbies, we have around 8 in total, wanted to go to the toilet, aka a tree. She asked me to come with her. I can understand that because it's better to be accompanied at night, especially in the woods. She does her business, and I suddenly hear a noise. It's far away, but not that far. I tell myself it's nothing. It must be some animals trying to find food. We go back to the tent, and that's when I hear footsteps approaching. As I hear those footsteps, I remain calm and tell myself, maybe it's the old lady checking on us, and to see if we didn't make the fire too close or something. But I still have an odd feeling, because it's midnight. Why would she come out at this hour? Then I hear no more footsteps for 10 minutes. Then I hear more coming to our tents. Thankfully, all the girls are sleeping, because they would have been scared. I was the oldest one, and they were about 3 or 4 years younger. As I hear the footsteps, which seems to be coming from one person, I hear others coming from the back of the tent. I was like, okay, this is getting weird. I need to do something. I checked the tent by the inside, and thank God, one of my newbies left some embers on the fire, so I could see what happened between the fire and the zip of my tent. A minute passes, and a silhouette is there in between my tent and the fire. I stopped breathing. I literally froze. I started to move toward my phone when I saw the silhouette coming closer. It was getting closer to the zip of my tent. I sent a message to one of my bosses, who thankfully was camping in a nearby area and was there just in case something happened. But I know that it would take too long, so I had to think of something and think fast. That's when I had an idea. I put my alarm on my phone. It was a big siren, because sometimes we would do like night games and wake up in the middle of the night. So I put my bell on, and my girls wake up. The silhouette started to unzip my tent. I actually saw the fingers from below, but as the silhouette heard the girls wake up, he or she started to sprint back from where they came. That's when I saw 2 other silhouettes sprinting back in the same direction. Thankfully, everything ended well. And 20 minutes later, my boss came and stayed with us for the rest of the night. I never had to deal with those silhouettes again, thankfully. Thank you for joining me for this episode of The Creepier about camping. Camping's really fun. I really enjoy it. As a matter of fact, I think it's a good time of the year to start doing it. Probably stoke up one of those campfires in the backyard and roast some s'mores. Hope you guys are having a good day, and I hope this doesn't deter you from camping. It can be very fun. Just make sure to take your precautions. Make sure to be safe. I want to give a special thanks to my patrons. Your help is very much appreciated. If you want to become a patron, you can find the link down in the description. Again, thank you for joining me, and until next time, this is Dallas, signing off.